Hello everyone, hope you're having a good week so far. An exciting first week diving into federal aviation regulations. I want to take an opportunity to review a few points that we've already covered this week to hopefully add a little additional clarity and also cover a little bit of new material, so let's dive right in. The review points that we want to cover first are dealing with federal aviation regulations, advisory circulars, and certification. So let's dive into FARs. Should be somewhat familiar with the structure of the federal aviation regulations so far. Like I mentioned in a previous video, this is a federal law. This is where we get all of our basis for the work we do in aviation, from everything from designing and certifying aircraft to fixing them, altering them, flying them, and providing certification for the people who work on and fly those aircraft. Now, I've put a couple bullet points here on the left to hopefully add a little more clarity. As we look for information within these volumes, it's important to remember what it is we're looking for and where we can reference this. And because this is a legal document, everything tends to be very specifically written. So the first volume is going to deal with definitions and procedures pertaining to aircraft. This also includes the aircraft themselves, so the basis for certification, definitions that define one kind of aircraft from another, and things like that. Volume number 2 is going to be pertinent to the people who work on, who fly the aircraft, who are involved with aircraft operation in one way or another. It's also defining airspace regulations as well as general operating and flight rules. Now, typically we refer to Part 91, which is within Subchapter F, very frequently, as this defines essentially all of the rules we have for flying, at least under normal conditions. That's where we transition into Volume 3, where we start to talk about special operations, and there's some very distinct pieces in here. One of the most common that we refer to frequently is Part 121. That's what we're referring to when we talk about flag and domestic air carriers. The other one is Part 135, which refers to commuter air carriers. Both of these, however, refer to the operation or the ongoing performance of these kinds of institutions. When we get into the earlier parts of Subchapter Subchapter G, when we look at these earlier parts, we're really looking at definitions. And that's another thing that is important to understand the federal aviation regulations. When we peruse through 14 CFR, one of the things we'll notice is in the early portions of a volume or the early portions of a subchapter, the FAA tends to go through the process of defining and determining who is eligible to this particular section or part. You see this a lot of times within parts as well. As we get a little bit more familiar with Part 21 or Part 23, you'll notice at the very beginning, the early on sections of those parts will start to talk about what this part categorizes and who's applicable to. So that's kind of how we see things. After we get those definitions established, and the FAA will tend to provide a little more detail on the actual operations or requirements within that part. Another piece that we didn't have time to talk about before are Special Federal Aviation Regulations, or SFARs. Now, these are sort of independent of the regular sections of 14 CFR. Not to say that they aren't a part of them, but they're used in a special way. They're numbered sequentially, so they don't have any correlating number to whatever part they may be applicable to, as you can see in the table here, and they tend to be temporary. As you look through a couple of these, we see SFAR 100 through 2 is relief for U.S. military and civilian personnel who are assigned outside the United States. Most recently, we've seen a few SFARs come into play that regard coronavirus in itself. So these tend to have a limited application, both in scope and time period, and that's where we see the SFARs come in. They don't get referenced as frequently as our regular parts of 14 CFR. When we talk about finding information, again, we have a couple sources that we're going to look at. When we're looking for federal aviation regulations, we're searching within 14 CFR. A very good resource for that is ecfr.gov. It's the government's website. Another landing page that's very useful is faa.gov/mechanics, which has been outlined in your Canvas course as well. That is a nice jump-off point for a lot of information that is pertinent to performing your job as a mechanic. That'll also lead you to the regulation database or the regulatory database that has things like airworthiness directives and type certificate data sheets within as well. Next on our review is advisory circulars. Now, again, in our other video, we focused primarily on one advisory circular in particular, and that is the AC 4313-2B. That is an expansion on Part 43 of 14 CFR that helps to define in better detail a lot of the information that we need to be able to perform maintenance tasks properly. Now, the interesting thing about advisory circulars is they are different from regulations because they are not necessarily something that requires compliance. Additionally, they may not be what we call approved data. Now, approved data is a very specific term that we use in aviation. Whenever we make an alteration or a major repair, we need a basis for why we've been able to make those repairs, effectively some kind of engineering backup. Advisory circulars may not apply as approved data for all aircraft because of the differences and the complexity of aircraft that are flying out there. So we can't necessarily use that as a basis for that. However, all of the methods that are listed within this particular AC are what we consider acceptable methods, which means if you perform the work in that manner, it will be legal and fine unless superseded or instructed differently by an aircraft manufacturer. So again, this is dealing with a lot of legal language, so it can be very challenging to find some of the differences, but the more time we get practice actually reading the documents and trying to pull information out of them, it makes it easier to understand what these differences are. Third up on our review section is certification. Our first step was type certificates. Now, again, you'll probably remember from the first video, type certificates are issued when the FAA has approved the design methods of a particular aircraft. Those design requirements are what we see in 14 CFR parts 23 through 35 and is overall outlined for issuance of those certificates in part 21. Now this has to be obtained before we can produce a type certificate data sheet because the two really go together, and you'll see how that works in just a minute. But these type certificates are important because they apply to airframes, engines, and propellers. All three will have to have a type certificate if they're going to be used on a certificated aircraft. Now, here's where the type certificate data sheet comes in. We have a type certificate, which as you saw on the first page, doesn't have a lot of information behind it, and that's where the data sheet comes in. This is going to be tied specifically to a type certificate, so it's issued with the approved type certificate, and it's going to describe all of the details, and this is the key part that I really want you to remember about this, all of the details that are related to performance and flight. That's a very, very important thing to remember. People get lost trying to dig up information between maintenance manuals and type certificates and things like that. It's very, very important to remember that this is all of the details that are related to how it impacts the way the aircraft flies. So weight and balance, CG location, the type of engine it can use, the type of propeller it can use, information about the oil being used, spark plugs, every bit of information that is going to dictate how that appliance, whether it's an engine, propeller, or the airframe itself, perform, it's going to be in this type certificate data sheet. This also provides the basis for what we consider conformity inspections. That's a huge part of what you're doing as a mechanic. When we have an aircraft and we want to maintain it in an airworthy condition, which is, again, a specific bit of legal language when we define the state that an aircraft is, in order to maintain it in an airworthy condition, it must conform to its type certificate, which means it must match everything that we see on the type certificate data sheet. If something is changed and there's no basis for supporting that change through a supplemental type certificate, then technically speaking, that is not the airplane that the FAA has certificated, right? So if I have, again, we'll use the example of this Piper Archer. If I have a Piper Archer that was certificated under this type certificate and I alter something, the FAA will no longer recognize that as a Piper Archer because it no longer conforms to that type certificate, which means it is now unairworthy. Its airworthiness certificate that would have applied is no longer valid because the aircraft no longer conforms to that type certificate. It's a very, very important bit of regulatory information to understand how this comes together. So, what happens if we have difficulty finding some information? We know that we can find type certificates for most of what we're working on, but what happens if we have an aircraft that was certificated before the FAA was around and we had this type certificate system? Well, we have a section called Aircraft Specifications. It's a special listing of information that is pertinent to aircraft that were certificated before January 1st, 1958 under the Civil Aviation Authority. Similarly, what happens if we have a very rare aircraft? With less than 50 remaining examples, we have aircraft listings. Again, it's an independent, separate list that is categorized for very, very rare or not mass-produced aircraft that will allow us to find information that details similar to what we'd find in a type certificate, but not exactly the same because, again, the type certificate data sheet is its own proprietary form for tracking this information. So it can be helpful, but it's not always going to give us the exact same set of information. It is helpful, though, to reference if we're working on something and we're maintaining continued airworthiness and it hasn't been recertified under the new rules. Next up is our supplemental type certificate. Now again, our type certificate defines everything about that aircraft. As long as the aircraft conforms, it is covered under that type certificate. However, if we can find a good reason to change something, and we want to go through the trouble and expense of engineering it and proving to the FAA that we have engineered it properly and it is not going to cause any damage to the aircraft or make it unsafe to fly, then we can apply for a supplemental type certificate. It'll deviate from the original type certificate. It doesn't invalidate it. It's still covered by that type certificate for everything other than what this supplemental type certificate speaks to. A good example of this, many aircraft engines in the early 50s, even into the 60s, did not use what we would consider modern spin-on oil filters like you would be used to seeing on your car, for instance. So a lot of companies have made modifications for engines where you can install an adapter that will allow you to use a spin-on filter, which has the advantage of being a whole lot easier to maintain, install, and remove, and also does a better job of filtering in most cases. That would be considered a deviation from that engine's type certificate. Therefore, those companies need to apply for and obtain a supplemental type certificate. And that's one of the things that drives up the price when we purchase aftermarket parts for an aircraft as well. Because we aren't just paying for the part itself, we're also paying for all the trouble that company went to get everything certificated under an STC so that we can install that on the aircraft. As a result, the joke that if you buy something for an airplane, add a zero tends to be pretty true. On our last part of certification, let's talk a little bit about airworthiness certificates. Here we have an example of what this document looks like. This is required to be carried on board an aircraft at all times. If we sell the aircraft to somebody else, then the airworthiness certificate travels with the aircraft. This is issued when the aircraft is manufactured and inspected initially for conformity. It could be a brand new plane that's been built. It could be a plane that was rebuilt and is no longer going to be able to conform under the original airworthiness certificate. Either way, this is something that should cover the aircraft for its lifespan unless we change something or we do something to make it unairworthy. An example of how this works, these two rather complicated diagrams that you see in your textbook in the 883, they're difficult to understand, but they make a little bit of sense here with some explanation. We'll take a look on the left side with original airworthiness. So with original airworthiness, what we're looking at is the airworthiness certificate itself, and this comes from the Aircraft Certification Service, which is a separate portion within the FAA. It's a larger governing body for aircraft certification. Now, as we've looked so far, everything that provides the basis for certification comes from Part 21 in 14 CFR. So located right in the center is Part 21, which is our certification procedures. Now, all of this information that you see floating around it are all supplementary pieces of information that are going to provide the basis that lets us certificate something under Part 21. So on the left side, we see Parts 13 through 39 that all talk about the original airworthiness standards. So some of those should look familiar. We've looked at Part 23, Part 25 covers transport category airplanes. Part 27 covers normal category rotorcraft, so on and so forth. Whatever portion we're referencing, so if I'm going to try to get a airworthiness certificate for a normal category aircraft, then I'm going to be referencing Part 23 for my conformity. What that means is the FAA has defined everything that needs to go into a normal category aircraft to be considered safe for flight. We have to meet those standards. I'm going to reference those standards. However, the basis that I'm using to make my application for certification comes from Part 21. What this kind of helps you to see is that as we start looking at how these regulations come together, we don't get to just focus in on a single part of 14 CFR. We're going to have a jumping off point, but then we have to go on the scavenger hunt to try to figure out all of our supplementary information that's going to support what it is we're trying to do. The reason that's done is because it makes a little more flexibility in how the regulations are written, and it also, oddly enough, makes it a little bit easier to be able to understand what we need to reference. Now, the chart on the right looks a little bit more complicated, but it's actually a less complicated process overall. This is our recurrent airworthiness. Now, where this falls in is we have two parts of the CFRs that are being brought in now. We have Part 21, which is the original certification. Then we have Part 91 and Part 43, which are both brought in. Part 91 and Part 43 are going to cover the maintenance procedures as well as the inspection intervals on aircraft. All aircraft in the United States that are operating under a standard airworthiness certificate, with some exceptions, are going to require an annual inspection at the minimum. This means that there has to be a certified, authorized inspector who is going to perform an annual inspection, effectively seeing that the aircraft still conforms to the original type certificate and therefore is still covered under the standard airworthiness certificate. That's the first part. We have to make sure that the aircraft currently conforms. The other portion of this comes from Part 43, which talks about all of our maintenance operations. Effectively, the way to summarize this is that the aircraft has to conform with the original type certificate. Additionally, in order to keep it conforming with that type certificate, all of the work that's been performed on the aircraft has to be done in an acceptable fashion, and that's where Part 43 comes in. That AC that we referenced earlier that talks about acceptable methods and practices, those outline in detail those, again, acceptable methods and practices that would constitute appropriate maintenance for an aircraft if we were going to maintain its airworthy status. If for some reason either work has not been accomplished in compliance with Part 43 and therefore would not be applicable to the airworthiness of the aircraft, then the aircraft could be deemed unairworthy. Additionally, if there are modifications or problems on the aircraft that keep it from conforming with its original type certificate and there's no supplemental type certificate to stand on, then the aircraft could also become unairworthy for that case. This is a very specific thing again though. People get very, very confused when we talk about maintenance practices, and they can get really hung up on understanding what airworthiness means from a legal standpoint. Now, if we pull a bunch of parts off of an airplane for maintenance, then you would look at the airplane and say, well, that's not suitable to fly right now, so I would call it unairworthy. The problem is, if we use that in a legal sense, namely we write it in a logbook or something, we have now made a statement about the aircraft's compliance with its original type certificate. And that's a problem. If we say that something is unairworthy, then we now have to go through a different process to recertify the aircraft as airworthy. On the other hand, if we're performing maintenance and it is not going to cause the aircraft to deviate from its type certificate and we can accomplish it within the range of Part 43, then we're not deeming the aircraft unairworthy, we are removing it from service. And that's kind of an important definition as well when we talk about what you're legally allowed to do as a mechanic, because again, there's very specific terms, and we'll dig into that a little bit deeper later. Of our airworthiness certificates, we have a couple different classes. We have our standard and special airworthiness certificates. The standard airworthiness certificate will cover normal, utility, acrobatic, transport, and manned free balloons. And the Special Airworthiness Certificates covers another few sections in addition to what we consider special permits and experimental permits. Special permits could include things like ferry permits. If we have an aircraft that is out of compliance for some reason, we can apply for a special ferry permit to allow the aircraft to be flown to an airport where the proper work can be done, and we can get that exception. The other exception is experimental, which really gets used in two ways. The most common way is for aircraft that are home-built, aircraft that are used for exhibition, air racing, things like that could not be covered under another airworthiness certificate, can be issued an experimental permit, and that allows it to operate. Typically, that will be done without a set period of time. However, the other version that we see of this is when a new aircraft is being manufactured and is going through its prototyping phase, then it may be issued an experimental permit, but for a limited period of time while that aircraft is being prototyped. Now on to the new information. I know it's a lot of legal language here, and unfortunately that's kind of how federal aviation regulations works as a class, but we're getting close to the end of the legalese and we can start looking at how this applies to us as mechanics. But before we move on to that, airworthiness directives are very, very interesting in a safety perspective and also an operational perspective. As we've seen, there have been a number of aircraft accidents throughout history. Some of those have been due to pilot error, some of those have been due to poor maintenance, others have been due to mechanical failures. We try to limit mechanical failures as much as possible, but every so often there is a serious design flaw that can cause a great deal of damage to an aircraft and even cause the aircraft to be lost. A good example of this is TWA Flight 800, which happened a number of years back. It was a 747 that had a fuel tank explode due to a couple critical design flaws between the air conditioning units and the center fuel tank. That generated an airworthiness directive. Effectively, it's a regulation that goes into 14 CFR that applies to aircraft, engine, propellers, and appliances when an unsafe condition has been found. These are mandatory. You must comply with airworthiness directives within the specified period, and sometimes it can happen more than once. You may have an AD that requires that it is inspected or performed every 500 hours, every calendar year. It just depends on what the determination is. But they must be complied with. If they are not, the aircraft can be deemed unairworthy. These airworthiness directives will modify the operation the airworthiness certificate of that aircraft or operation of that aircraft to correct the unsafe situation. The way that airworthiness directives are released come in two stages. We have an NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which is issued to allow any operators of the aircraft, anyone else who may have input on this particular issue, to provide feedback to the FAA. Again, this could range from additional engineering information, or it could go as far as an airline trying to make the case that if they release this airworthiness directive too soon, it could be an undue financial burden and they need to come up with a different way to be able to comply to correct this unsafe situation. That's what that period is for. That's considered a commenting period after the NPRM is released. The NPRM will be out for a certain period of time. They allow time for comments, and then afterward it will be turned into a final rule, in which case that airworthiness directive is now put into 14 CFR and becomes federal law. People are notified by this through email now. Once upon a time, the FAA would do paper delivery of airworthiness directives, but now they exclusively deliver through electronic methods. The exception to this, because there's always an exception, is the emergency airworthiness directive. An emergency AD is typically reserved for a time when there is a crucial error with an aircraft design that would have an immediate impact for loss of equipment or life. It would be for instances where it is such a dangerous situation that allowing the normal comment period and the normal bureaucratic process to release an AD would be unacceptable and again could cause a loss of life. So emergency ADs will come out without those periods beforehand, and they typically have a very quick time of compliance. This time of compliance again can range. On occasion, you may have an airworthiness directive that applies to your specific aircraft, but because of serial number or because of operation classification, you may not have that airworthiness directive be applicable to you. On the other hand, it could be that there's an airworthiness directive for an engine that says you have to inspect a certain part, say a crankshaft, at the next overhaul. Well, if you just had your engine overhauled a couple months ago, then depending on how the airworthiness directive is written, you may not have to comply with that until the next overhaul. The key about this is it falls into two categories. Ultimately, according to Part 91 of 14 CFR, compliance with airworthiness directives is the responsibility of the owner or operator of the aircraft. However, there is an exception to that. Mechanics are held responsible for complying with airworthiness directives for an aircraft that they are working on. So, if an aircraft comes into your hangar, you do an AD search on it, you find that it does have an open airworthiness directive on it, you are legally compelled to comply with that airworthiness directive or at least remove the aircraft from service. If the owner, for whatever reason, is going to refuse to do the work, you still must remove the aircraft from service. You cannot pass the aircraft back onto the owner with a few exceptions. But again, it's a very important legal definition, and we'll again talk more about this when we talk about the responsibilities and limitations for mechanics. Last piece about airworthiness directives, they are numbered in a very specific format. In this case, we're going to take a look at an example, AD 99-07-01R1. The way this breaks down, 99 is the year that this was issued, so 1999. 7 is the bi-weekly period. So bi-weekly, we mean every 2 weeks. So the 7th period of 1999 would be either the 13th or 14th week of the year. It's a little bit confusing, but typically if you multiply your bi-weekly period by 2, then you'll have kind of an idea of what week of the year it is. The last number, 01, is the numerical order that this AD was issued. So 0701 tells us it was the first airworthiness directive that was issued on the 13th or 14th week of 1999. A little complex, but it is a system. And then R1 at the end is actually a very important one for us to note. That is the first revision to this AD. As an AD comes out initially, it may not have a revision. As the AD is changed, which they do sometimes, the revision number will change. So when we check for ADs or we check for AD compliance, that can be a very sticky portion. Sometimes people will forget to double check that the AD, as it was originally complied with in the logbooks, may have been an earlier revision, and we have to make sure that the newer revision does not indicate something different and make sure that things are up to date. That is everything we have for this third lecture of this week. Hope you've enjoyed the material. If you have questions, again, please reach out to me on Canvas or through email. I'll try to help you as I can. And hopefully next week we'll have an opportunity to set up a Zoom meeting to do some question and answer if necessary. Again, hope you have a good, safe weekend. Don't have any trouble with fireworks out there, and we'll see you sometime on Tuesday.